If an avoidant told the whole truth, it would sound like this, and the first thing you would notice is not drama, not excuses, not even confidence, but contradiction. Because the truth has never been a clean explanation for them. It has always been a mixture of what they feel and what they fear feeling at the same time. And if that truth ever came out fully, without filtering, without emotional control, without the instinct to protect themselves from vulnerability, it wouldn't sound like someone who doesn't care. It would sound like someone constantly overwhelmed by caring in ways they don't know how to hold. That is the part no one sees from the outside. People often interpret distance as lack of emotion, but inside it is often the opposite. It is emotion without structure, intensity without direction, feeling without the internal tools to stay present in it. And that is where everything begins, not in indifference, but in emotional overload that never learned how to stay still. "It wasn't that I didn't care" is usually where the truth starts, but even that sentence feels too simple for what actually happens internally. Caring is not the problem. The problem is what caring does when it becomes too immediate, too close, too consuming. Because for someone with avoidant patterns, emotional closeness doesn't arrive as comfort, it arrives as activation. The nervous system doesn't interpret deep connection as safety at first, it interprets it as pressure. Not because the other person is doing anything wrong, but because being emotionally seen, emotionally needed, or emotionally depended on creates an internal sense of responsibility that feels heavier than it should. And when that weight builds too quickly, the instinct is not to lean in, it is to step back just enough to breathe again. That is why the distance happens, not because feeling is absent, but because feeling becomes too loud to process in real time. And when closeness starts to feel like pressure instead of love, something subtle but powerful begins to happen internally. The emotional system shifts from connection to regulation. Instead of thinking, "this feels good," the internal experience becomes, "this feels like too much to manage at once." Even positive emotions can become overwhelming when they arrive without space. Affection starts to feel demanding. Consistency starts to feel binding. Emotional expectations, spoken or unspoken, begin to feel like obligations rather than shared experiences. And in that state, the mind starts searching for relief, not from the person, but from the intensity of what is being felt. That relief usually comes in the form of distance. Not emotional rejection in intention, but emotional regulation in execution. But from the outside, it never looks like regulation. It looks like withdrawal. And then there is that moment, the shift that nobody really sees happening in real time. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with conflict or explanation. It is internal, quiet, almost invisible. One moment there is engagement, presence, emotional availability, and the next, something subtly tightens inside. The pace of interaction feels different. Responses become slightly delayed, not because of lack of interest, but because emotional processing is happening in the background. Attention starts splitting. One part remains connected, while another part begins pulling away to regain internal stability. And this is where the disconnect begins, not between two people, but within one mind trying to balance connection and emotional safety at the same time. The outside world only sees the distance. The inside world is already in negotiation long before the silence ever arrives. And if that inner world could be spoken without defense, it would sound like, "I don't leave because I don't feel anything. I leave because I feel everything at once and don't know how to stay inside it without losing control of myself." That is the paradox that rarely gets understood. Emotional intensity doesn't always translate into emotional closeness for them. It can translate into emotional disorientation. When feelings become too layered, too fast, too deep, the internal system doesn't stabilize, it fragments, and fragmentation creates urgency. Not urgency toward the relationship, but urgency toward emotional escape. Because staying present in that intensity feels like losing internal balance. So distance becomes the only way to restore it. Not as punishment, not as rejection, but as a form of emotional breathing room they don't know how to ask for in any other way. And while all of this is happening internally, the external version remains calm, composed, sometimes even distant in a way that feels confusing to others, because what is not expressed outwardly becomes invisible. So people assume nothing is happening beneath the surface. But the truth is there is often more emotional activity happening in withdrawal than in connection for them. Overthinking doesn't stop, it intensifies. Questions don't disappear, they multiply silently. But none of it gets communicated in a way that would make sense externally. It stays internal, unspoken, and often misunderstood even by themselves. And that gap between inner experience and outer expression is where most misunderstandings are born. because what looks like absence is often internal overload without language. And if you're still here, still watching, still trying to understand what usually gets left unsaid, you might as well subscribe, because what we're breaking down here isn't just behavior, it's the emotional psychology most people feel but never get explained in a way that actually makes sense. And beneath that calm exterior, something far more complicated is constantly unfolding, an internal dialogue that rarely reaches words yet shapes every decision about closeness. If the truth were spoken in full, it would admit something uncomfortable. Silence often feels safer than explanation, not because explanation is impossible, but because explanation risks exposure. Because once emotions are translated into words, they become real in a way that cannot be easily controlled anymore. And for someone who already struggles with emotional intensity, making it real feels like giving it more power than they can manage. So silence becomes a kind of containment strategy, not to erase feeling, but to keep it from expanding beyond internal boundaries. But containment has a cost. What is not expressed does not disappear, it accumulates. And accumulation always finds another way to surface, even if it is indirect, delayed, or misunderstood. That is why silence feels safer than conversations, even when conversations could potentially bring clarity. Conversations require presence. They require emotional availability in real time. They require responding not just to words, but to the emotional weight behind them. And that level of engagement can feel overwhelming when the internal system is already processing too much at once. Silence, on the other hand, creates space. It removes immediate demand. It allows emotions to exist without external pressure. But what it also does, quietly and almost unnoticed, is prevent resolution. Because nothing is clarified in silence, nothing is fully understood, and over time, what was meant to create safety can slowly become the very thing that maintains distance. So what starts as protection gradually turns into separation, not always intentional, but increasingly structural. And still, even within that separation, attachment doesn't disappear. It shifts form. It becomes quieter, more internalized, less visible. There is often a part that still misses deeply, still remembers clearly, still feels the emotional imprint of connection. But that part exists alongside another part that fears what happens if that connection becomes too present again. So the internal experience becomes split, one side leaning toward closeness, the other pulling back toward safety. And when both sides are active at the same time, movement becomes inconsistent. Not because of manipulation, not because of indifference, but because emotional direction itself becomes unstable. That instability is what creates the pattern others experience as confusion. Coming close, stepping away, returning again, withdrawing again. It is not randomness, it is internal conflict without resolution. And if that conflict could be fully spoken without defense, it would sound like a kind of emotional contradiction that is hard to simplify. I miss you, but I don't know how to stay without feeling overwhelmed. I want closeness, but I don't trust my ability to remain steady inside it. I feel connected, but connection also activates something inside me that I don't fully understand. So I leave, not because the feeling isn't real, but because the intensity of it becomes too much to hold at once. That is the part that rarely gets expressed. Because expressing it would require vulnerability about vulnerability itself. And that layer is often the hardest one to access. So instead, behavior becomes the language, distance becomes the sentence, silence becomes the explanation that was never actually spoken. And underneath all of this is something even more subtle, the guilt that rarely gets acknowledged directly. Because from the outside, it can look like indifference or emotional withdrawal without consequence. But internally, there is often awareness of impact. Awareness that distance affects others. Awareness that silence creates confusion. Awareness that pulling away leaves questions unanswered. But that awareness doesn't always translate into correction, because correction would require staying in emotional discomfort long enough to communicate through it. And if emotional discomfort is already the trigger for withdrawal, then the cycle reinforces itself. So guilt doesn't become action, it becomes internal pressure. Quiet, persistent, unspoken, something felt but not resolved. And over time, even guilt can become something that is pushed aside, not because it isn't real, but because there is no clear internal pathway for processing it in the moment it arises. That is also why going cold can happen without warning. From the outside, it appears sudden, a shift in tone, a reduction in engagement, a change in emotional availability that feels immediate, but internally, it is rarely immediate. It is the endpoint of accumulated internal overload that has been building gradually. The emotional system reaches a threshold where engagement no longer feels sustainable, and instead of expressing that threshold, it shuts down responsiveness. Not to punish, not to reject, but to reduce internal stimulation. And because the internal threshold is not visible to others, the change feels abrupt externally. But inside it feels like relief mixed with conflict. Relief from intensity, but conflict from disconnection. And that combination is what makes the pattern so difficult to understand from the outside. And somewhere within that cycle, there is also a fear that rarely gets spoken directly, the fear of being seen too deeply. Not seen in a superficial sense, but seen in a way that removes emotional hiding space. Because being fully understood emotionally means losing the ability to retreat into ambiguity when overwhelmed. It means being emotionally accountable in real time. It means having feelings reflected back with clarity that cannot be easily deflected. And for someone whose regulation strategy depends on distance and internal processing, that level of visibility can feel exposing rather than comforting. So there is often a quiet tension between wanting connection and fearing the level of emotional exposure that connection naturally brings when it becomes too close, too consistent, too real. And when that fear of being seen too deeply meets real emotional closeness, something subtle begins to happen that is rarely visible from the outside. It is not rejection in the way people assume, and it is not a lack of interest. It is more like internal disorientation. Because being emotionally seen removes the option to remain partially hidden, and partial hiding is often where emotional safety lives for them. So when connection becomes too consistent, too clear, too emotionally direct, the internal system starts searching for an exit, not from the person but from the intensity of being emotionally exposed in real time. And that exit is rarely communicated. It is felt first, then acted on silently. The shift is not a decision, it is a response. A response to internal overload that builds faster than it can be processed. And once that threshold is crossed, behavior begins to change before words ever have a chance to explain why. And this is where another hidden truth begins to surface, one that is often difficult for them to fully admit even internally. Emotional reactions don't always feel trustworthy. Because feelings can arrive in waves, shift intensity quickly, and sometimes contradict previous states within a short span of time, there is often an underlying uncertainty about what is real versus what is temporary. So instead of trusting emotional immediacy, there is a tendency to step back and observe it from distance, to wait for emotional intensity to settle before deciding what it means. But the problem is, in the time it takes to stabilize internally, the external world has already interpreted the distance as detachment. And that gap between internal processing and external perception becomes one of the core misunderstandings in their relational patterns. What feels like necessary pause internally often feels like withdrawal externally. And neither side is fully wrong. They are just operating on completely different timelines of emotional processing. That difference in timing also explains why consistency feels unnatural. Consistency requires emotional presence to remain steady over time, even when internal states fluctuate. But when internal emotional states are highly variable, maintaining external consistency can feel like suppressing natural rhythm. So instead, behavior becomes cyclical. There are moments of closeness when emotional accessibility is present, followed by moments of distance when internal regulation takes priority. And from the outside, this can appear unpredictable, but from the inside, it often feels like survival-based adjustment. The system is not trying to confuse anyone, it is trying to maintain balance between emotional engagement and emotional safety. The issue is that those two states rarely coexist smoothly without conscious communication and emotional tools that can hold both at the same time. And then there is another layer that rarely gets acknowledged directly, the discomfort of emotional dependence. Not in the sense of not caring about someone, but in the sense of recognizing that emotional closeness can create internal reliance that feels destabilizing. Because when another person becomes a primary source of emotional grounding, any shift in their availability can feel internally amplified. And for someone who values internal independence as a form of stability, that amplification can feel like losing control over emotional regulation. So distance sometimes functions as a way to restore that sense of internal autonomy. Not because connection is unwanted, but because dependence, even emotional dependence, triggers a need to re-establish internal equilibrium. And that process, while protective in intention, often creates confusion in the relationship dynamic. But beneath all of these mechanisms, distance, silence, inconsistency, emotional withdrawal, there is still something that rarely disappears entirely: emotional awareness of connection. Even when behavior suggests detachment, there is often an underlying recognition that something meaningful exists or existed, but that recognition does not always translate into sustained presence. Instead, it often exists alongside avoidance strategies, creating an internal contradiction that is never fully resolved. And unresolved internal contradictions do not disappear. They manifest externally in cycles: closeness followed by distance, engagement followed by withdrawal, presence followed by silence, not because the connection is meaningless, but because the internal system cannot stabilize within it for long periods without regulation breaks. And if that internal truth were spoken without filters, it would sound less like detachment and more like fragmentation. I don't always trust my emotional stability when things get too close. I don't always know how to stay present without needing space to reset. I don't always understand my own reactions in real time, so I step back to make sense of them. But stepping back changes how I appear to others, even when my intention is not to disconnect. That is the contradiction they live inside. Feeling deeply but needing distance to process feeling. Caring strongly but struggling to remain consistent within that care when internal intensity rises too quickly. And because this contradiction is rarely communicated directly, it becomes visible only through behavior rather than explanation. And over time, this unspoken internal structure begins to shape regret. Not immediate regret, not dramatic regret, but delayed emotional understanding. The kind that arrives after distance has already created clarity. Because once space is established, the intensity lowers enough for reflection to occur without overload. And in that reflection, patterns become more visible. The impact of distance becomes clearer. The emotional weight of inconsistency becomes more noticeable. And what was once defended internally begins to be seen from a different angle, not as intention but as outcome, not as protection but as effect. And that shift from intention to outcome is often where late emotional understanding begins to form quietly in the background of everything else. And when that late understanding finally begins to form, it doesn't arrive as a dramatic realization or an emotional breakdown. It arrives as something far quieter, almost inconvenient in its subtlety. It shows up in pauses between thoughts, in moments of reflection that feel slightly heavier than before, in memories that no longer sit neutrally in the mind, because what once felt justified in the moment begins to feel different when viewed from distance. Not wrong, not malicious, but incomplete. And incompleteness is what the mind struggles with the most after emotional intensity has passed. The actions still make sense in isolation, but the emotional impact of those actions starts to become more visible when the urgency to escape them is no longer present. And in that space of reduced intensity, clarity begins to form, not as judgment but as recognition of patterns that were never fully understood while they were still happening. This is where internal contradiction becomes more noticeable, because the same system that once used distance as protection now begins to recognize what that distance created. Not immediately, not all at once, but in fragments that slowly connect over time. A moment of silence that once felt necessary now feels heavier in hindsight. A period of withdrawal that once felt like regulation now feels like separation. And conversations that were avoided begin to appear in memory not as threats but as missed opportunities for clarity. But the important part is that this recognition does not erase the original emotional experience. It simply adds perspective that was not available in the moment. And perspective, when delayed, often carries a mix of understanding and quiet discomfort. And as this internal reflection deepens, something else begins to surface alongside it: awareness of emotional impact. Not in an exaggerated or guilt-driven way, but in the simple realization that emotional distance does not only affect internal balance, it also affects external connection. Because while the internal system may experience withdrawal as regulation, the external experience of that withdrawal is often confusion, uncertainty, and emotional disorientation. And that gap between intention and impact is where most regret begins to take shape. Not because harm was intended, but because consequences were not fully visible in the moment they were created. And once those consequences become clearer, they cannot be unseen. They simply become part of the internal narrative that follows. But even then, this realization does not immediately translate into change, because understanding something emotionally is not the same as knowing how to do something differently. Awareness